Addis Business Talk with Khalid and Marid on Afro FM 105.3. We'll be talking to policymakers, investors, business leaders, and entrepreneurs to bring you the latest development taking place in the Ethiopian economic and business climate, and more importantly, what it means to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Addis Ababa. This is Addis Business Talk with Khalid and Marid every Thursday morning on Afro FM 105.3. My name is Khalid Mawi, along with my co-host Marid Bisrat. Thank you very much for tuning in. The show is brought to you by Pragma Investment Advisory, an investment management and advisory firm based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, along with our partners at 251 Communications, a very well-known PR and marketing firm based in Addis Ababa as well. Now, our guest today is none other than His Excellency Dr. Eyob Tekalign. I'm sure he doesn't need much introduction. As most of us are aware, he is the State Minister of Ethiopia's Ministry of Finance. And among many other dignified roles, he was also the Commissioner of the National Planning Commission. I'd like to begin by thanking you, Your Excellency, for accepting our invitation to appear on our very first episode of the show here today. We really couldn't think of a better guest to address some of the most pressing issues that we're facing in Ethiopia, especially with regards to the economic impact of COVID-19 or the coronavirus, and the growing concerns that we all have. So thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. So why don't we gently begin with our discussions? My first question would be, it's something that maybe some of us are wondering in terms of especially the unprecedented circumstances that the coronavirus pandemic has imposed upon us. What does a workday in the life of Dr. Eyob look like at the moment?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't think I should try and mince words. This is very tough. These are really, really difficult times in all sense of the world. As you can imagine, this pandemic is sort of the worst enemy we have ever seen in our lifetime. I don't think I've seen anything as bad as this in my lifetime. I'm sure you share the same sentiment. And this takes a huge toll on public sector officials. As you can see, those activities that the government is undertaking, it takes a huge toll on us. Clearly, the task, the primary task, the most pressing priority, as you can imagine, is saving lives and livelihoods. So this requires a lot of concerted effort by government officials, a lot of coordination. So the day could start early in the morning, probably before people make their prayers, and could end up late in the night. There will be calls that go on until 9, 10 p.m. and then you need to catch up on paperwork, respond to emails. It's a tough time, to be honest. And the kids are at home, as you know, and they complain why daddy is always going out when everybody is staying at home. And we're still going out. In Ethiopia's context, it requires for us to be in the office. I think I should just say it's a tough time, but also a pleasure to be of service to the nation at this critical time.
Perfect. Wonderful. Nowadays, economists are calling this time chronomics. The outbreak of COVID-19 is having a severe impact on the global economy. Recently, the Ethiopian Planning Commission has revised the GDP growth of Ethiopia from the initial 9% to 6%. Commendably, the Ethiopian government is preparing an emergency fund, economic stimulus package, and regulatory reliefs. I think 2 weeks ago, the Ministry of Finance has proposed a very comprehensive emergency plan with a ticket size of $1.6 billion, requesting development assistance group. In the plan, it expects the coronavirus outbreak would persist for the next coming 3 months. My question is, how much of the requested fund has been secured and reached the coffers of the government as we speak now? And what percentage of is debt or grant?
Thank you so much, Merid. By the way, just to clarify, as you said, that 1.6 billion, about 1.64 billion is mainly for emergency-related needs, but our request is probably much bigger than this. for economy-wide impacts, other than saving lives and livelihoods, so saving businesses could require significant amount of resource. There will be huge pressure on balance of payment. So I just wanted to point out the need is much bigger than this. But on this one, on the question you asked, we are very much encouraged by the response from partners. Discussions are underway with our bilateral partners and multilateral partners, the World Bank, IMF, and I can say generally it's encouraging. With the IMF, for instance, we expect the IMF board to approve an emergency support fund, what they call RFI, in about 2-3 weeks' time. The bank is also looking at its coffer, at times prioritizing some of the projects, and we are in discussions for a much bigger additional, supplementary budget. The bank has recently announced, as you know, a $500 million budget support, which was part of the ongoing cooperation. But for this emergency, they want to supplement this, and that is advancing very well with the European Union and with a number of our bilateral partners. Discussions are underway. Most of these supports would largely be in grant, but there will be a loan component, for instance, with IMF and with the World Bank as well. The World Bank usually, the support is partially grant and partially loan.
Your Excellency, the business community right now is very anxious to hear a sector-specific response plan in terms of forex allocation for manufacturers, exporters, or is there a potential of opening of a credit line for big enterprises or an extensive tax breaks? What do you say to the business community? Does the government have any plan to address their concerns? And do you have any plan also for small and medium enterprises?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, generally, as you probably have been, noticing, the response, the government's response to this pandemic has been measured, pragmatic, and quick. That's how we see it. Initially, for instance, before even the virus. On the early days of the outbreak in Ethiopia, we felt that some of the sectors are already hardly hit, sectors like tourism, hospitality in general, some of the export sectors. So what the government has done is, in consultation with the private sector, in consultation with the banks, we devised a strategy on how firms can keep their employees and also their businesses afloat during these difficult times. And for that, the amount of liquidity that the government has injected through private banks ideally would cover a big chunk of this request from the hospitality industry and from key exporters in restructuring their loans and also for additional working capital loans. But on broader sector-specific measures, in fact, the economic team has also undertaken deeper consultations with key stakeholders like the Jobs Commission in assessing the impact of job losses or threatened losses on SMEs. We've had also, I think, useful conversation with other sectors, agriculture, manufacturing. So the general package is I think, coming through in the next couple of days. The council is expected to sort of review the proposal by the macro team and would approve additional set of economic measures that are really targeted. As you said, sector specific. For instance, let me just give you an example. If you want to keep businesses afloat, one critical challenge they have is how do they pay rent, for instance, or how do they pay salary for their employees. So the sense from the government side is how do we share this cost with the private sector so that we can collectively pass through these difficult times. So yes, the government will continue to assess the situation on the ground and respond to sector-specific and general economic measures that we think would help us weather this storm.
Okay, so let me come up with a follow-up question, especially relating to the potential long-term economic headwinds because of COVID-19. Now, I know you have acknowledged the fact that there's a sentiment brewing under the surface of growing concerns and uncertainties regarding the impact of COVID on Ethiopia's economy. We have a number of economic experts who've made a few projections. You may have heard of those. On the mild side, you have about 2.5 to 3.5% GDP hit by the likes of the IMF and Ethiopias. On the worst case scenario side, you have up to a forecast of a 10% hit to the GDP, as well as some 200 billion birr of potential economic damage. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Your Excellency, but it seems like the government is now more focused on a short-term 3-month scope mitigation plan. So the real question is the government paying serious attention to potential long-term economic implications of the pandemic if, God forbid, the pandemic prevails beyond the next 3 months? How is the government planning to deal with long-term headwinds due to COVID-19?
That's a very interesting question. Just to make an important correction there, I think our strategy is comprehensive. Of course, in this kind of crisis, your top priority would be saving lives. So to that end, I think we've done a significant amount of work in answering the question of how do we save lives and how do we implement social protection to those people whose livelihoods are being upended because of this pandemic. But inbuilt is also strong provisions to build economic resilience. In fact, in Ethiopia-like economy, you can't just sort of sequence this. There's no cycle issue here. You don't say, okay, let me respond to the pandemic and then I will come back to the economy in 6 months down the road. In that case, the damage could be a permanent shock, and it would be very, very difficult to restart the economy if you don't sort of build in important, economic resilience measures. So our strategy is broader. As I said, protecting lives and livelihoods, but also our ambition is to sort of build in strong resilience measures so that the recovery could be quick, sort of a V-shaped recovery, if you like, so that we can quickly come out of this pandemic. But also, as part of our strategy to protect vulnerable communities, to make sure people have enough to eat, we're also focusing on agricultural productivity, on productivity of some of the key manufacturing sectors. So this by itself will sort of give you an interesting perspective on how you can maintain some key economic activities during these difficult times. In fact, in some of the sectors, like agriculture, for instance, the Ministry of Agriculture is mobilizing resources and also mobilizing efforts across the nation, in all regions, to actually increase production more than the targeted yearly plan. And why is this important? Because we have a crisis now. We have to make sure there is enough food for not only the vulnerable group that you've mentioned earlier, but for the larger society. We have 110 million people, and we have to make sure these people are fed properly. The supply chain has to be intact. Some of key productive activities should remain intact, of course, with all precautions, because if you don't respond this way, while you're fighting, the health pandemic, you might lose lives because of lack of food, because of hunger. And these are equally important things. So in some sectors, actually, we expect more productivity than what is actually planned. For agriculture, for instance, the estimates vary, but a minimum of 20 to 30,000 metric tons additional production is what the Ministry of Agriculture is working on by creating the special arrangements, for instance, availing pumps to regions so that they can use irrigation, quick irrigation for production of key vegetables and cereals. Again, in key manufacturing activities, with all precautions, we are trying to make sure food production and other key activities remain intact, and also medical equipment, masks, PPEs. It needs to be produced locally as well. So the point I wanted to make is this is not a cycle issue. You don't just say, let me deal with the pandemic now, and then 6 months down the road, I'll come back to the economy. It won't work that way. So we're working on it simultaneously.
Addis Business Talk.
The show was brought to you by Pragma Investment Advisory and 251 Communications.
Addis Business Talk.
Recently, the International Air Transportation Association has revised the global airline loss from $250 billion to more than $310 billion. Our own proud Ethiopian Airlines currently operating on 10% capacity, and it's declared a loss of $550 million because of the outbreak of the coronavirus. Recently, on a press conference, the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines, Mr. Tekalign, said the company has shifted its strategy from cargo operation and aircraft maintenance, which usually account for only 50% of its revenue. So my question is the government of Ethiopia ready to bail out Ethiopian Airlines if needed? And if the bailout is there, part of your discussion, will the bailout be in dollars or dollar plus birr, or when you do the bailout, is it going to be a debt injection or equity injection?
Well, thank you, Marin, for that question. I think it's the discussion on bailout is too early. As of now, what the airlines is trying to do is to be creative and adaptive of the current situation. As you said, the CEO has laid out his strategy on how he thinks the airlines can sort of weather the storm. And shifting to cargo, for instance, is an important aspect of that strategy. So this will support the airlines somehow, but clearly won't be a complete solution. But also the airlines is discussing with creditors. As you know, the airlines has AAA credit rating, so financing the airlines would be definitely the most important priority. Making sure this airlines is preserved, whatever it takes to preserve the airlines and to make sure it comes out of this crisis safe and sound is a very important strategy for the government. But the details depend on really how things turn out globally. We hope it would be if there would be sort of a slight recovery in the economy first quarter of next fiscal year, and if the airlines can resume some activity and so on, I think it might be much, much better than our worst fear. Of course, you always prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. But let me just say this: the government will take every possible measure to support the airlines. But as of now, we are confident that the strategy that the management has laid out would help it carry on for some time to come. So there is no bailout discussion as of yet because it was not required immediately.
All right, excellent. A question about digital economy. Now, we know that within the homegrown economic reform agenda, there's particular focus on ICT as one of the priority sectors, and rightfully so. There's a brief outline, clearly outlined specific areas of focus that will be paid attention to by the government regarding ICT. Now, I know you are perhaps personally a proponent of trying to identify and nurture new and productive sources of development, such as, for instance, startups and the involvement of youth entrepreneurship, financial technology, telecom services, and so on. Now, trying to sort of wrap this around the COVID context, the question is, as a sobering experience to many countries around the world who are forced to rely on technology for their population to remain productive members of society, what has perhaps the government learned regarding the importance of technology during these times of crisis, and what kind of measures does it plan to take towards perhaps an enhanced focus on ICT, particularly but not limited to the fintech and telecom space as catalysts for maintained and improved productivity?
No, that's a very, very important question, clearly, Khalid. And I am, as you said, personally, I have a strong, passion about the digital economy, but this is not personal. I mean, at the government level as well. As you probably have gathered over the last couple of years as part of the homegrown economic reform, one important agenda that came to the fore is the idea of building inclusive digital economy. This is very, very important for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure your listeners are pretty much aware of. So if your question is, should we have done more in previous years? Yes. I think we could have done much, much better in building a strong, inclusive digital economy over the last decade or so. So that's very unfortunate. But one thing I must add is, though late, some of the early efforts we put in place, as a foundation of a digital economy, are kind of paying off encouraging results. Look at some of the startups that are now leading in launching digital payments and markets, to promote social distancing. Some initiatives, in the diaspora and here as well, for mobilizing resources. It's I think, fulfilling to see some delivery options already being available in Addis and in other cities, supported by digital technology, and also government's formidable move to avail services online. The government e-service, I'm sure you've seen a big chunk of our services have gone online over the last few weeks. And I guess I would say these are very, very promising initiatives. They will help us to cope with the pandemic. But most importantly, it's a very important signal that prepares us for the post-COVID-19 global economy. So I guess if any agenda is more elevated during this crisis, is the agenda of building strong, inclusive digital economy. So I agree with your implied message that we might need to do more on the digital economy, and also that going forward there will be a renewed focus in ICT sector in general. But I'm glad we have at least started something early on over the last year and a half, which has enabled us to respond quickly to some of the risks during this crisis.
To follow up, you earlier mentioned that the Ethiopian government has announced the economic stimulus package of $15 billion into the banking system at the same time to alleviate the liquidity crisis in the banking system, which is a very commendable act by the government. But as you also mentioned that the loans are being rescheduled and interest payment is being waived. My question is, and also the banking sector is very keen on to listen, is if the crisis lingers on more than we expected, and if the liquidity crisis to continue, is the government ready to announce another second, or if possible third round of stimulus package to avail another liquidity crisis in the banking system?
Merit, look, these are extraordinary times, right? Our priority is, as I said, protecting lives and livelihoods, preserving businesses, and then creating the right environment for a quick recovery in the economy. So the government is ready to do everything it takes, to achieve the objective. So in that regard, as I said, all measured but appropriate policy measures are on the table. And unfortunately, because of our reform, over the last 2 years, we focused on macroeconomic reform, which is sort of enabled us to tighten up the fiscal space, sort of ensure fiscal prudence, and also modernize our monetary policy, stabilize and minimize our debt burden in general. And I think that reform has provided us now with an opportunity, with ammunition, to deal with this crisis. We have some space to respond. Imagine if this crisis had happened when we had that significant macroeconomic imbalance. It would have been a crisis. But now I want to reassure your listeners who said the banks or the private sector that all options are on the table. The most important priority is saving lives and livelihoods. So other things are secondary. I mean, this is not a time where you worry about extreme fiscal prudence. You use every tool that you have to avert this crisis. So yes, absolutely, all options are on the table, and people need to be reassured that the government is doing everything it can.
Great. Regarding agriculture, you've mentioned earlier on, and thank you for pointing out some of the policy measures that are being taken, especially regards to agricultural productivity and some of the additional production measures that are being taken. You've also recently partaken in a commendable effort to hand over a large number of tractors to a farming community here. Although assumptions remain that the agricultural sector will not seriously be affected during this outbreak in our rural communities, at least in the short term. We have instances, for example, in India, where earlier on, a large number of smallholder farmer communities have been incorporated in the stimulus package plans that they will be recipients of in the relief efforts. Obviously, the agricultural sector is one of the most important ones in Ethiopia because we depend on it for economic survival. To unfortunately add fuel to the fire, there are recent reports, according to, for instance, Grow Intelligence, which is an aggregator of agricultural data. They have said that about 18 million hectares, or about 84% of our cropland, has been invaded by swarms of desert locusts. This is nothing like we've seen in the past 25 years or so. It scares me to think that we could be perhaps submerged in a form of dual crisis. If you could perhaps keep in mind the locust outbreak that is probably pushing the country towards a food crisis, and then on top of that, COVID that could, God forbid, linger towards the farmer communities, how does the government plan to perhaps mitigate some of these issues? What has it thought about in this regard?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I guess, first of all, as I mentioned earlier on, the government is working to safeguard the agricultural sector from the immediate impacts of the pandemic, so that we can ensure food supply is maintained and productivity is enhanced. This is very, very important. In fact, to that end, arrangements are underway to make available inputs to farmers so that they can prepare for the next season. And also, national and regional food supply chain and logistics networks are being mapped out, in collaboration with regional and local governments, so that we make sure there are no disruptions to the supply chain and the national food distribution and supply remains intact during this difficult time. This is very important, and this is, I think, very well in the making. And again, the plan is not to just deliver on the yearly plan, but to even produce more. But as they say in Amharic, we have this locust invasion, which unfortunately came at a very, very bad time. So this could affect, a big chunk of the farmer community, about 1 million, some estimates show. But with all our development partners, I think we're waging a full-fledged war against this locust invasion. I want to thank some of our partners like FAO, the World Bank, and others that have availed quick resources to support the Ministry of Agriculture's effort in fighting against this locust invasion. So it would have some impact, but I guess this concerted effort to sort of minimize the impact would probably help us mitigate the worst case scenario. And yet, we have to have a plan B. So if some of these farmlands are affected, how do we compensate for those? Would be part of the additional production plan that the Ministry of Agriculture is working on. But generally, our sense is it would have some impact for sure, but the efforts that are underway would help us minimize the impact. But to answer your question more broadly, when we map out available food stock, so we leverage on existing infrastructure. As you know, we have a proven whole of government approach to economic and emergency management. For instance, we have safety net programs, programming in the rural areas. That's probably one of the largest in Africa, I assume. I don't think there is any other country that has such a robust and well-functioning safety net program. And in fact, we have also a mechanism on how we can support the transitory poor, people who are occasionally affected because of some crisis. Now, this locust crisis could affect certain people, and they might fall into this transitory poor category. And for that, we have this bigger safety net program and the general emergency response plan that you mentioned at the beginning, which has sort of looked at vulnerable groups more broadly, including some groups which might be affected with this locust. I think would help us respond to this crisis. But I'm not undermining the challenge. It's very unfortunate. But I'm glad we are on top of it and trying to minimize the impact in both ways, both from the invasion, but also support for those that might be affected by the invasion if the worst happens.
Addis Business Talk.
Did you know that Ethiopia's public and private pension fund collectively manage 115 billion birr? Did you know that Ras Hotel was the first share company in Ethiopia in 1956?
Did you know that close to 70% of the population in Ethiopia lives without electricity? Addis Business Talk.
If you don't mind, Your Excellency, let's try to switch over to a broader set of questions outside of the COVID-19 topic. The first one being developmental state. Some would argue that our state-led economic development model looks to be a form of double-edged sword. You have one side where favorable conditions prevailed because we have built mega infrastructure projects that have fostered growth in productivity, industrialization, growth in GDP, FDI, and so on. But also a multitude of hindrances, unfortunately, such as corruption, red tape, heavy bureaucracy, lack of leadership accountability, and at times marginalization of the private sector, and of course, accumulation of heavy debt going forward. My question is, how is the government addressing this matter to tackle key deterrents so that eventually a smooth transition can occur for a thriving private sector to take over?
Yeah, thanks. Well, you asked a question that is very close to my heart. Someone who was in the private sector before and also worked on public-private partnership. I think I have seen firsthand how the deep mutual suspicion between the private sector and the government has sort of stifled innovation, creativity, and sort of hindered a much more inclusive and dynamic economic growth, because a key player in that activity, the private sector, was pushed out for a considerable amount of time. I think one major failure we had in the past is this notion that the government can do it alone. Look, governments play a very important role in the economy, and they continue to do that, whether in the West, East, or anywhere else. If you look, if you review history of economic development, you'll see that governments play a very important role in transformation of societies. And I believe in that. So, I mean, I have a Keynesian influence in my thinking in economic development theory. So I think there is no confusion there. But having a strong government that sort of mobilizes the whole nation for development is one thing. But keeping off, a big chunk of society from taking meaningful role in the economic development is another thing. So for me, a national development goal is a collective enterprise. It's not something that you leave for the private sector or for the government. So meaningful collaboration is very, very important. So the shift, over the last couple of years is this mindset, the mindset that the private sector is productive, that the private sector is the engine of the economy. Of course, I mean, if you read some of our policy papers, it says even in the past that the private sector is the engine of the economy. But I think practically, as I said, because of that mutual suspicion, because of this categorization of private sector as rent seeker, productive, non-productive, and that division has created deep suspicion between the two sectors. And the government, unfortunately, has not been efficient enough as well. If you have a strong developmental state, you need to have a strong bureaucracy, a meritocratic bureaucracy that can marshal resources, human, physical, financial resources across the nation and direct the nation towards meaningful societal transformation. Unfortunately, we've lacked both in the past. We didn't have a strong bureaucracy, strong government, but we've also sort of squandered the opportunity to create a robust, dynamic private sector. What gives me hope is there is a complete shift in mindset, both in the private sector and also in the public sector, on this meaningful collaboration. So I see hope that this collaboration would thrive further. And over time, as the two parties continue to work together in collaboration for this collective enterprise that I mentioned earlier on, we have a very promising future for meaningful societal transformation. So I'm very happy you brought that question. So what do I see? I see a significant move in that direction, but we have a lot of additional works to do. For instance, building the capacity of the private sector, creating a strong civil society, and also strong bureaucracy is something that is included in this reform agenda. And as we work on this, I think we can create a more conducive environment for private sector to thrive.
Question to the privatization process of the homegrown economic reform agenda, working tirelessly to deliver this on time. Part of the privatization process is the opening up of the entire telecom sector of Ethiopia. I know that this time is a very difficult time to deliver it on time. And how is the government currently taking actions to run the entire privatization process smoothly? And has the government come up with any revised timeline yet?
Well, I mean, clearly, because of this pandemic, for one thing, your priorities would shift as you're dealing with a crisis. And secondly, the general global environment would have some impact on the timeline. But in terms of the agenda, because it's a very important reform, reforming our state-owned enterprises, and as part of that, privatizing some of them is a very important reform agenda. So we are continuing to push on this agenda. In fact, work is ongoing, for instance, with potential bidders on the licensing side. The Ethiopian Telecommunication Authority, ECA, Communication Authority, ECA, is planning on conducting probably a virtual consultation forums. Some of the consultants are still working from home on some of the paperwork, the bid documents and so on. So we are continuing to push, and the macro team is also reviewing progress periodically, even during these difficult times. But for some of the activities that might require, physical interaction. Like, say, if a potential bidder wants to do a due diligence and want to visit some of the sugar factories, as you can see, that is not very conducive now because of the travel restrictions and the general precaution that governments, including the Ethiopian government, is taking. So, it would have some impact on the timeline, but really as movements resume and as the global economy comes back on track, we should quickly deliver on this because on the background, the work is progressing.
Okay, if I may ask you two questions back to back about the financial sector, you can perhaps give me a bundled answer to it. Evidently, you sit on the board of the National Bank of Ethiopia. You have mentioned before that as per the economic reform plan, part of the financial sector reform objectives is to modernize the national bank and the country's financial infrastructure so as to apply world-class monetary policy measures for economic stability, but also to push towards narrowing the supply and demand gap that we'd sort of see when it comes to innovative financial product offering, which we think can really help promote financial inclusion to be able to bank the almost 70% population that are yet unbanked. So my first question is, how's the government furthering these objectives and implementing them into action? My second one is regarding capital markets. Some may say that it's considered to be a preferred source of alternative capital. Others may argue, especially with regards to the announcement of its instigation in 2020, such a decision could be rendered premature due to unfavorable conditions that could hamper, for instance, the development of a stock exchange. Some of the criticism is lack of proper regulatory capacity and framework, lack of robust infrastructure and systems, lack of reliable telecom and connectivity, and so on. How does the government respond to these concerns and therefore perhaps defend gearing ahead with the establishment? Is there a way you could perhaps give us an update on what is the current status of the ongoing development of a stock exchange, but also of the secondary bond market and the corporate bonds that were also announced previously?
One important reform area really is, modernizing our monetary policy, but also creating a more vibrant, capital market. So to that end, as you mentioned rightly, the government has set a target to establish secondary bond markets, or markets, and then over time, full-fledged capital market. So what I sort of disagree a little bit with how you pose the question is, you don't sort of complete your preparation for something in sequence. Like, you don't say, okay, now I have enough regulatory capacity, then let me move to regulatory issues, or let me move to infrastructure issues like telecom, or let me look at the key participant. Do we have enough interest? For instance, if we start a secondary bond market, who would be the key participant in the market? I think you can do these things in tandem, and that's what we are doing. For instance, as part of the overall financial sector reform, the National Bank is undertaking a number of studies, and in fact simultaneously doing preparations to start secondary bond market as quickly as possible. Now, you said regulatory capacity, and you mentioned some infrastructure challenge like telecom. But remember, while we are working on this capital market, stock market study, we're also reforming our telecom industry. Telecom sector is undergoing significant amount of reform. And look how far Ethio Telecom has come over the last year or so. The amount of new services that Ethio Telecom has launched, and how, for instance, during these difficult times, the company managed to sort of increase its capacity and make sure we are all connected virtually when people are working from home. So the fact that our reform is much broader and has looked at all critical challenges, I think comes in handy when we want to sort of complete one certain thing at a given timeline. So to give you an update, clearly, as we've set out, modernizing the treasury bill market has already been commenced. I'm sure as you gather, banks and pension funds are purchasing treasury bills from Ministry of Finance through NBE, through competitive process. Interest rates, usually we used to purchase treasury bill at a predetermined prices, a price generally set by policymakers at MOF and NBE, but that has changed. And that the idea was that would create enough momentum, for key operators in the financial sector and pension funds to sort of start exercising the market. And then simultaneously, we're working on a strict timeline to launch, the secondary bond market. And to that end, we've identified existing capacities, including ECX, for instance. Can we leverage ECX as an important modality? Or do we need a different sort of arrangements? Second, it's not only the regulatory capacity, but what kind of capacities do you need in the market in general? For instance, brokers. You need to have brokers to trade, right? And how do we train these brokers? What kind of regulatory framework do we need to have? How can they be trained? Can we avail quick trainings? What experiences are better from other countries? So it's a whole encompassing and deeper preparation is underway to move to a full-fledged market by the timeline. Now, what can we do in the next year, and what might drill a little bit into the second or third year is something that I think we can discuss further based on initial findings. I know the National Bank has set up a May timeline, for instance, an April-May timeline to finalize this study and present it to the board. The management is working on this. So really, in the next couple of months, May, June, some announcements are forthcoming in this regard, because a lot of work was going on. And in fact, some of our development partners have been very, very supportive with this as well. And also bilateral partners in sharing their country experiences, in sending experts and so on. So we've not talked much about it, but Khalid, a lot of work is going on the ground. And I'm sure we'll definitely deliver this within the timeline.
Excellent. I think I would shift towards my very last question at this point, and hopefully this is one that can induce a sentiment of humility and inspiration for all of us. As you may know, we can witness the rise of an invigorating, refreshing, solidary relationship in Ethiopia between the private sector, the public sector, and civil society at large, and especially in this much needed collaborative and concerted efforts towards the fight against COVID-19. You may know many companies have contributed large amounts of cash to designated institutions. I think that the numbers are at 340 million birr and counting, or they're opening their facilities for, say, patient care or warehousing purposes. The government, of course, which you represent, has been doing outstandingly by spearheading policy response measures and developing stimulus packages to fight against COVID. And civil society, of course, doing what it can, especially from those who are the most fortunate to those who are less fortunate. Really, my question is, would you say this is the beginning of the end of the infamous sentiment of mutual suspicion that you've mentioned earlier that seems to unfortunately persist between the private sector and the government? What do you make of this humbling experience and the shared responsibility that is transpiring on a daily basis?
This pandemic is a global challenge, right? I mean, it requires coordinated efforts from governments, private sector, civil society, as you said, and then all segments of society. The scale of the challenge remains overwhelming. as I said earlier on. But I think personally, as you said, what I found humbling, and also what I think is sort of shielding us from the worst, is our collective resolve to protect the well-being of our citizens and our sense of humanity, our sense of the spirit of collaboration, the spirit of cooperation. Now, look at what has happened over the last months. How quickly the private sector has responded to the government's call. Initially, when it started mobilizing resources, leading by example, the Prime Minister, the President, members of the Council, and top government officials have sort of donated their 1 month's salary and asked society to chip in, because this society is a very overwhelming challenge and that we're trying to tackle. The response is amazing. It's not like the amount of the resource, but how widespread it is. There are people who have availed their homes. There are people who have availed their warehouses, their hotels. There are individuals who gave just 1 or 2 chicken, or a kilo of butter, or an egg. It doesn't matter. 5 birr on Ethio Telecom, or millions sending a check to the Resource Mobilization Committee, sending in food, or feeding 5-10 people in their neighborhoods, or there are people who are feeding 200-300 people, taking turns. So that, I think, collective resolve really is what gives me energy as I wake up every day. I know we are in it together. I know everyone is trying to do their level best. Everyone is trying to make sure we manage this crisis and get out of it with little impact as possible on lives and livelihoods and on businesses and on the economy in general. And I'm sure that's what's going to happen. If we continue on this track, if we stay on track, I think we should be able to overcome this challenge and return to our path to prosperity as has been laid out by the Ethiopian people and the government. And also the kind of innovation we have seen. Was that whole of government approach, our capacity to mobilize resources, this collective decision making, learning by doing, the established community trust, and our ability to use existing structure and machinery has been a very, very essential tool for us to effectively respond to this pandemic. Let me just give you one interesting example. The Millennium Hall, right? I mean, this is a multi-purpose hall. I'm sure you've seen how this was refurbished into a COVID-19 treatment center. It did not just sort of double our capacity overnight, availing 1,000 beds overnight. But I think for me, it signals the organizational efficiency of the leadership, and then the meaningful contribution of all stakeholders, how the effort is managed creatively in a concerted way, and how we are all in it together. So these are difficult times, Khalid. I know we are all worried. We don't know what tomorrow brings. We are all guessing on the epidemiology side, on the economic impact, and so on. But trust me, I know we'll overcome it. I have that confidence because we are working together. If we stay on track, as I said, if we continue on this collective resolve, which is very, very important, I'm sure we can save many lives and livelihoods, and then achieve a very quick economic recovery and continue our path to prosperity.
On that was a very wonderful remark, Your Excellency. Absolutely, we're going to overcome this situation and prevail. And As you can listen, all our listeners all over the world at this time, now is the time to stay safe, to hold on to one another and hope for the best. And on that note, Your Excellency Dr. Eyob, thank you very much to be on our show. It was a very insightful and very great discussion. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eyob.
Thank you.
Addis Business Talk.
This has been Addis Business Talk with Khalid and Merid every Thursday morning from 7:30 to 8:30 on Afro FM 105.3. We'll be with you next week, same time, with His Excellency Commissioner Ababa Babayo from Ethiopia Investment Commission. Stay tuned and keep it safe. We'll see you next week.
Addis Business Talk.